How long? Hello, 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 and welcome to Intercultural Talks. I'm excited to have my guest today. Her name is Lindsay Grossman, and she is a product and people leader who excels at the intersection of technology, global markets, and connecting people and ideas across borders. So she's worked for the likes of Netflix and Intuit and Stripe. She's negotiated high stakes, high tech partnerships and managed teams around the globe with past home bases in India, London, San Francisco, and now in New York. She is also one of the nicest, funniest, and most authentic people you could ever meet. So, Lindsay, welcome to Intercultural Talk.
Thank you so much. That's a very kind introduction. Today.
So, and what I hope is, I think, so before I get really personal, because for full disclosure, Lindsay and I are also cousins. So before we get totally personal, I want people, and by people, I mean also me, but I want people to understand the level of leadership that you've achieved and the impact that you've had globally on people's lives. So, you said things like you took on the role of leading Netflix's partner payments team in Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and the Americas, or you were Intuit's group manager, global strategic partnerships and business development. What does that actually mean in terms of budget and people? Like, how big is that?
Yeah. So the various roles that I've had in tech across like financial tech companies like Stripe and Intuit, and then a company like Netflix, the roles really varied. And as I have grown in my career, obviously the level of like the breadth in your portfolio expands, as well as the depth, like in terms of the level of expertise, but also the number of the people that you manage. When I started my career, I was what they call like an individual contributor, right? I have a boss, but I don't have people reporting to me underneath. But as I grew in my career, I wanted to get more of that people management experience. So it started when I first managed a consulting firm at that time at Intuit. And then during my 5 years there, expanded into roles where I would manage people. And similarly at Netflix, I had a role that was both people management as well as individual contributor. And then at N26, which was my most recent role, I had an org of about 21 people, which was comprising of both people who like solid line reported into me into the reporting chain, as well as dotted line. So functions like product marketing, who were a part of my extended leadership team.
And how big of a budget?
Yeah, I think the budget's really varied. Netflix has a really interesting culture. Actually, the CEO, Reed Hastings, just wrote a really interesting book called The No Rules Rule, and about the Netflix culture, that there's no predetermined rules where you have to get budget approval. You kind of just have to be a responsible adult using Netflix's funds, in a responsible manner. So I didn't really have to apply for budget to execute the projects and the partnerships that we were doing there. When it came to companies like N26, the type of budget that I would look for would be really around like cost of headcount, because in a tech company, if you're in the design org or marketing org, you'll have like out-of-pocket costs, like let's say advertising budgets, et cetera. But the type of functions that I've been, really the main costs are how much it costs to pay someone a salary. So
it's a salary. I'm thinking, so I'm going to pop this up here. So I'm thinking of, when I talk about budget, what I'm talking about is like, what's the size of the money? So I saw this, like this Stripe's global partnerships with China's Alipay and WeChat. Like, that's huge. 25, it was enabling businesses in 25 countries to sell to hundreds of millions of consumers. And I understand that was your role there, and you were actually involved in managing and negotiating that partnership.
I led that, exactly. I led that partnership for Stripe from conception.
You need to stop being bashful. So I'm old fashioned. Let me do it like we were talking before we came on about my dad, who's Lindsay's uncle. But my dad would say, explain it for us peasants, Lindsay. Like, when I talk about impact, so if you're doing a partnership that is allowing businesses around the globe to sell to China, like the economic impact of that, is that like in the billions? Like, how big is that?
Well, I actually, and it's been a while since I've been at Stripe, so I actually don't know what their volume or like the amount of money that's processed through their rails, so to speak. But the types of deals, like that deal very specifically with Alipay and WeChat Pay, that you're talking of, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not upwards in the billions in the future, because that was basically a tool that helps businesses sell to Chinese consumers through the two most popular payment methods, which are Alipay and WeChat Pay. So yeah, like the scope of the things that, is doing is quite large. Similarly to the deals that I did at Netflix, you're talking about adding new, like millions of customers thanks to these partnerships. And the economics that flow between these companies that I would often do partnerships with are typically in the form of a rev share. So let's say in the case of Alipay and Stripe, they together build a product that helps businesses process payments to Chinese consumers. There's going to be a share of that economic value. Same
and who
for
shares
the deal.
it? So there's a share of that economic value in terms of Netflix would then, since that was the company you worked for at the time, they would share some of the revenue that came from that.
Yeah, exactly. Like if Netflix and Sky work together, there's going to be a type of rev share or discount model that if they drive each other new customers, who is ever driving that, will share in that value. You can, there's lots of different economic models that you can do in partnerships. I've also done deals where you can have one partner contribute the marketing cost and do a lot of, pay for a lot of that out-of-pocket costs, which could cost a lot of money if it's a television commercial, for example, or if it's out of home. And then you'll have like spend on like performance or social media marketing. And then the other partner will discount their product, right? Maybe give it away for sometimes free, or give it for a big discount. So lots of different ways.
So Lindsay, so you're negotiating those partnerships. It sounds like then it's not only people that are based in different countries, because the people that are doing the partnership will be in different countries, but then each person who's a partner may be contributing different things as well. So it's really multifaceted and multi-layered.
Yeah, exactly. I think like when I think about doing really strategic partnerships, the exchange of like revenue or financial value is just like sometimes very transactional. What I really want to create is like strategic value where one partner has, let's say, an expertise in one business, and then the other company has an expertise in something else. And those are unique comparative advantages that when powered together, actually multiply the value. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2. It actually multiplies that value, something much higher. And so, I've had the great benefit of taking like negotiation classes. When I was at Netflix, we did a training with this Harvard professor who's like seen as one of the experts in negotiation. And I think one of the things that you learn in these deals is that negotiation isn't about trying to like get the most and make sure that the other party gets the least and to say, oh, I won. Negotiation is really a collaboration whereby both parties win. Really, it has to have that both parties feel like they're getting value out of it, because if you leave the negotiation table after it's complete and one party feels like they've really got the raw deal, that partnership is not going to last very long. And that party is also not going to be incentivized to create additional value for the long term. So I really do like to strike deals where both companies feel like they're getting a win out of this and they want to be invested in their skin in the game.
Sure. Well, and I had a question just in terms of Netflix. When you talk about, so I understand like when individuals have subscriptions, obviously, but when you talk about TV and mobile operator subscriptions, how does that work? So if Sky or Virgin Mobile has a subscription, what does that actually mean in real language, in like reality or in life?
Totally. So very simply, the partnership was Netflix did and does still work with traditional cable television companies like Comcast, or in Europe, like Sky or Telefonica. And those traditional media companies or telecommunications companies, even mobile providers like Verizon or others, they have their set of customers. They've been providing services in the case of like cable television for decades. Those customers may also be separately having Netflix directly with Netflix and paying two separate companies. Or in other cases, they have wanted to try Netflix, but they haven't gotten around to it yet or weren't sure of the value. And so by Netflix partnering with these companies like Sky and let's say Comcast, Netflix is able to get incremental new users, basically, that maybe they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, or it would have taken them a long time and a lot of money to get otherwise. Gets Netflix new customers. In terms of the traditional television and communications companies, they're able to retain those users and potentially also get new subscribers, because now Netflix is a part of the value proposition of what they are selling. And for the customer, it's a win-win, rather than, let's say, have to pay a separate Netflix bill and a separate let's say Comcast bill. You now have one deal where the price that you're paying to Comcast is giving you more value because you get Netflix included. So in many ways, it's not for free, right? But for the customer, they say, wow, I'm getting normal cable linear television plus Netflix, all for a combined price of X, whatever it is. And that value is almost always a better deal for the customer than if they had paid for those things separately.
Got it. So, and if people are watching live, please know that you can ask questions directly in the comments while we're chatting. I would like, so my head has already exploded just even listening to everything you do. Like, it is so multi-layered in the way you do it. Is everything in English? Are you ever doing anything in other languages? Do you speak other languages? I forget.
So in terms of, like, when we were at Netflix, most of our partnership, like communications and meetings and dealings, would be in English. Although when I worked in Spain, a lot of them were in Spanish. I had folks on my team who were fluent Spanish speakers, so they were able to help me out. I do not speak Spanish myself. When I was working in France, I worked on the Canal Plus deal. I do speak conversational French. I studied it in high school and for 1 year in university. Forgot everything 10 years later, then decided to pick it up because I actually, turns out, I married a Frenchman.
I was just going to say, and why is it that you practice your French now, Lindsay?
And so what that really helped me, though, like when I was working in France on a lot of deals there, actually, it's easier to have a rapport with your colleagues on the other side of the table, and to have some conversational language skills, if not fluent, are still really important. And then when I was in university, I studied Hindi as well, and then took a couple of classes after college as well. I forgot.
Well, now you lived in, and you know, I'm a language advocate, so I speak Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and someone likes to point out embody language. For Hindi, so I know one thing that was really transformational for you, just kind of from the outside, you know, knowing you as you were growing up, when you went and lived in India for a summer, like I saw that was it. Like, you were done with our Missouri, even though you love it and are back there now, but you're like, no, the world, I'm going to the world. What was it about? So I didn't know if you took Hindi because of that, but what happened during that trip, or what's a story that shows how that just changed your mindset?
Yeah. So when I was 19, it was the summer after my freshman year. So my first year of college at WashU. Having grown up in St. Louis and then also going to university in St. Louis, my first thought was, okay, my first summer in college, I'm not going to stay in St. Louis. I want to do something else. And so I walked over to it's called the Sticks International House. It's basically the foreign affairs or study abroad office. And I said, what summer programs are available? Because most people wait until their third year, their junior year, but I was ready to go overseas now. And I saw that the history department at WashU had a program in India. Again, it was a summer program. It was in Rajasthan, which is in the northwest part of India. And it was perfect for me. And so I applied. I remember the professor at the time, who then became a mentor of mine. He said, you know, usually I'm only taking third and fourth year university students who have become essentially South Asian scholars of history and politics. But you seem very naive and bright-eyed, but super passionate about it. I don't understand why, but I'm going to take you. And I accepted. I got accepted on the program, and that summer really changed my life. It changed my life for a lot of reasons. First, it was the second or third time I had been overseas in my whole life. It was a vastly different culture than the one that I had grown up. And this is one of the reasons I still love India so much, is the sheer diversity of it. You have a massive country in terms of geography, but many different cultures, upwards of hundreds of languages. Cuisines vary by region. fashion, religion, everything. Like there's no one size fits all for India. And that for me, like just captured my curiosity and my imagination. And so then when I came back, I continued to study political science, but then I focused very specifically on South Asian politics. I did my thesis on the political rights of women in South Asia. I quit French, ironically, and decided to take Hindi classes instead. So it really, for me, was kind of this moment where a lot of the intellectual curiosity I had about the world was just like really satisfied, and it was just the beginning of a lifelong journey. And I think what's so special about India, although I've worked there for a number of years, almost every job that I've had, I've worked there. And, you know, I continue to go back even for personal reasons to visit friends. You still feel like you don't fully understand India. And so for me, that's what keeps bringing it back. It's just, for me, I'm very intellectually curious about it. It's a very rich culture.
And do you still have family? So did you live with a family, or what kind of program was it?
Kind of had like a lot of different programs. So I actually ended up, that first summer I mentioned, I also went again my third year, my junior year of university, and I stayed in South India. So the first time was really more like a homestay. The second time was at the University of Hyderabad, like a big state university, and I lived in a dorm on campus. But I also volunteered with an organization called the Rural Development Foundation, which is focused on education and socioeconomic livelihood issues in village areas outside of Hyderabad. And so in volunteering with that family that ran the organization, really became very close with them, and they were super kind to me. I'm still very good friends with them. One of my best friends is their niece, and I actually am still on the board of the nonprofit now. So.
Oh, so you're on the board of the nonprofit that's based
that I
in
volunteered
India. Oh,
with
wow.
years
Oh, that's
ago.
cool.
Yeah.
And again, for those who are live, please do say hello so we know who's here, and feel free to ask questions as well. Lindsay, there's a couple things you said, and I'll give us enough time to get to both directions that could go. So one has to do with you talked about, like, you were just bright-eyed and, you know, and hi, I'm Lindsay. And but it's funny, but it's not, because being a woman business leader at the level that you are, I was even laughing as I was pulling slides together. And this is, I'm closer probably to the generation of your mom. And so I'm looking at stuff like this, like, oh, look, it's Lindsay at a big meeting. Look, Lindsay's leading a meeting. You know. And so my question for you is, as a woman leader at the level that you are, I noticed that, so I was reading your WashU bio, and like you had 6 jobs in 10 years, although 3 of them were with Intuit. But there's this idea of women hitting the glass ceiling. And so have you experienced that, or do you feel like you need to change companies to be able to get to that next level of leadership? Because each time you change, you've like, woo, it's been exponential. How is that, being a woman leader? How have you felt supported by companies, and what have they done right or wrong?
So maybe first I'll answer that in 2 parts. The first one will be like how I've generally thought about my own career growth. And then the second part of the answer, I'll kind of reflect on kind of maybe nuances or moments that I've been conscious of my gender in the workforce. So I think first and foremost, like the way that I've thought about my own career and like points when I've decided to make changes, like go to another company, for example, for me, it's all about learning. It's honestly related to why I find India fascinating. There is so much to learn. And I am extremely curious. People joke that I ask 1,000 questions. Usually I'm the one asking the questions. I do. I'm so curious. The world is huge. Life is short. Like, how am I going to find out all this information before I leave? And so the way that I've thought about my career is, am I learning in this job, wherever I am at the moment in time? Am I having fun? Is it challenging, right? I want to learn, but I also want to be pushed to be my best and to learn new skill sets. And I think I've always left jobs when I felt like I wasn't having fun or was not learning anything new. Maybe if it became boring or I wasn't like stretching my skills. So that's really what's kind of drove me in my career. I think the other thing that's really important in my career is, do I care about the thing that I am building? The thing is very often in tech companies, like the service that you're providing to a customer. At Intuit, the jobs that I was in, we were building products that help small business manage their money. for me, I'm very passionate about that. My parents are small business owners. I realized as I went into my adult life that I really had not been handed down like a huge understanding of finance. And so I know for the normal consumer, whether you be a small business owner or not, like financial literacy is not a given. And so I was really passionate about helping people manage their money. That passion transcended into places like at Stripe as well as N26. So I think that's a lot, like I really have to care about the thing that I'm building. And then I think in terms of the gender element, for sure, like you showed that picture, I laugh because indeed it is me in a meeting, but I guess you're right. There is something unique about it visually. Like I am coming from a different culture than the rest of the people in that meeting. And so it is expected that if you keep doing that over time, you're getting more cultural competency. You also have to be extremely self-aware because you can't come in, let's say, even if you know a lot of the answers in a meeting, you have to be super respectful of the way that you operate business in the country that you're working in. And so I think that I'm really conscious of. And I do think there's this extra layer of being a woman that, you know, people may have preconceived notions about how much you know, what you know, who you know. And so I think you really do have to earn the trust. And in some cultures, like in other countries, but even the United States, like there might be, let's say, microaggressions or just cultural norms whereby women having a seat at the table or perhaps even leading that meeting is a bit unusual. And so you kind of have to just navigate that a little bit. But
yeah. So what's an example of how you would navigate that? What do you do when that happens, when it's not the cultural norm, but you're the person who is leading the meeting?
I think when I'm first building a relationship with people, like I tend to ask a lot of questions just to learn about the other person. And that shows them that I am genuinely interested in who they are and what their goals are. Let's say if we're working on a deal. And so I think that in many ways starts to build trust because in some ways it's universal. Like people want to be understood and they want to be heard. So I think that's a way to kind of level set in the beginning. But then I think you also can't be afraid to like show your knowledge. I think there's one rule of thought, which is like, if you know the answer, don't say it, just lean back because you don't want to like, you know, you don't want to ruffle any feathers. I think that is a bit of a detriment. I tend to be a little bit more lean forward. And then I think
but who's that rule? That does not sound like something men would do. Like that idea, if you know the answer, don't do it. That feels more like something that someone would tell women to do so that they weren't themselves.
To be quiet and to shrink and all that stuff. So anyone who knows me will know I never am quiet. And so I've really not taken that advice. I've, as they say, leaned in, I guess. And I do think that is important, but you can't do it straight out the bat. You really have to understand like who it is that you're working with, understand what their preconceived notions are, and to navigate those. I guess the other thing that I'll say that I experience in different parts of my career is like what you call microaggressions or maybe unconscious bias. And that is really the undertones of bias and perception that sneak out, even though you yourself as the quote aggressor may not know that it's happening, right? We all have biases. We all have cultural blinders on based on where we're coming from, and we're all guilty of it. But the important thing about navigating that is being conscious of what those biases are. Do
you have an example of that?
Yeah. So like maybe sometimes if you've ever been in, like I had been in meetings before where I had said an idea or had an idea and the guy
and then 3 minutes later, a man in the meeting says it.
And then 2 to 3 minutes later, a guy says literally the same thing, almost the same words in many cases. And then everyone's like, that's a great idea. We should do that. And then you just look around. You're like, am I invisible?
Like, did anyone else see that?
Yes, exactly. So I think being kind of a victim of that, I've also been conscious to make sure that I amplify other women's voices in the meetings myself. So if a colleague of mine who's a female says something and I can tell it didn't really land, I'll say, hold up a second. Let's really understand what she said to acknowledge and to tease it out so that her idea can shine. That's one example. I think the other places that I saw it a lot in the tech industry, and I can talk about ways that I would combat this unconscious bias in the hiring process. It's oftentimes we'd be hiring people, like, especially in tech, right? Engineers or product managers or designers who were female. And if a majority of the interview panel was men, sometimes I would see comments like, oh, she's not technical enough. And I'd be like, well, wait a second. Like, she went to MIT and studied engineering, and she's worked at all these tech companies, and she passed the engineering test, right? So what is, quote, not technical enough? And you would dig, and what you'd realize was actually these were people's blinders, their cultural blinders.
It was just
that,
their
a woman
perception.
can't be technical. A woman can't be a good engineer. But those people are very liberal. They vote a certain way. They like to think they're super accepting and inclusive. And I think in a majority of their life that they are. But the point is, unconscious bias slips in when you yourself don't know it. And you need to be in an environment where you, as a team, you can call each other out in a collaborative way. It's not about blaming.
Well,
about
no,
saying,
but
hey,
you know what that is? No, that is really important, though, what you're doing, because a lot of companies now are just jumping on the unconscious bias bandwagon, where they're doing training to make you aware of your unconscious bias. But unless you actually have tools to actually suss it out, then it's not effective. You're just kind of left raw, knowing like, oh, I didn't know I thought all this. What you're talking about, though, Lindsay, is the tools of let's stop and break this down. It's MIT. It's, it's all of these things. So where are you getting that?
Totally. And I think in recruiting, it's really important. There's a lot of great tools out there like Greenhouse and a couple of other software that help every interviewer write their notes. As a hiring manager, I like to have a process that's as streamlined as possible so that the same rules are applied to every candidate, regardless of their background. And so when I have, let's say I'm hiring someone and I have 5 or 6 colleagues of mine who are going to sit on that panel and also give me feedback about whether they think I should hire this person, I will ask them to take detailed notes. I will, if they make a judgment, they say, hey, Lindsay, I think you should or should not hire this person. I'll be like, great. Did you judge them on the criteria that I asked you to? And give me the specifics of why you think or believe that. And I think that every hiring manager needs to have a high bar to create that neutral, standardized process, or else the goalpost keeps changing every time you bring in a candidate from a underrepresented background.
Well, and it also has to do with sort of their style and perception. Because even, let's say what we were talking about before, when a man says something very directly, he's thought of as confident. That's a great idea. A woman says something very directly, and it's like, oh, she's kind of bossy. It's also realizing you got to get rid of that bias.
Totally. And I think there's also a bias too that goes beyond gender or like race or any ethnic backgrounds, is also in style. So I'm an extrovert. I realized really early on that could be a potential blind spot of mine in terms of like, oh, I might go hire other people who are like me. And so
because it's really natural to want to connect with people who, of course, that's just a natural instinct. So you need processes to work around it.
And so I really challenged myself and asked my other colleagues to challenge me too, is to say, let's make sure that we hire people who communicate with all different styles. And so actually my last 2 hires I made were people who are definitely titled or they self-identify as introverts, and I'm proud of myself that I was able to hire those people because it was a little bit different interaction style of my own. And so I think you have to be vulnerable. Like, we all have biases, but you got to call them out, and you have to work around them actively and ask people to help you on that.
Well, one of the things, just some of the work that I do in diversity, equity, and inclusion with a partner company, Executive Diversity Services, there's so much research about the influence of culture is actually one of the biggest influencers on communication style. So it's all connected as far as bias and how you feel when you talk to someone, exactly based on gender, race, ethnicity, all those things. It manifests in how people communicate.
Totally.
Yeah. So political science major, which a lot of people sometimes do because they're thinking, oh, like I'll do pre-law or something like that. So how was that road for you, though, then to go from political science to being in tech? Because most of the work you do, it looks like it's a lot with payment systems and technology. So, what was that? How was that road?
Yeah, I think, and it probably goes back to one of my personal beliefs, which is just like do stuff you're interested in. I was really passionate and still am about politics. So that's why I studied political science. And then I focused even more specifically on foreign affairs in South Asia. I think after university, you kind of know the traditional routes where you could go work on Capitol Hill, you could go apply to be in the State Department or whatever. There's a bunch of different government roles that you can have. But I was a bit curious about like how foreign policy and politics could interact at the point of business and commerce. And so I went to work for a company for my first job called APCO Worldwide, which is a consulting firm. It helps businesses navigate policy and regulatory issues. It helps them deal with PR issues. Super interesting work. And then from there, got hired by a client of mine at the time, Intuit, who makes TurboTax and QuickBooks. And there, I still was arguably in a role that's where politics is really important. I was doing government affairs, so representing the company to regulators and to policymakers. So understanding political science and the global political environment is really, really important. But as I evolved in my career, I left the government affairs world and became purely on the technology side, building product through product management and partnership roles. And in my day job, technically I don't have to deal with politics in the external world, but unfortunately, sometimes you deal with people politics in your day job. And I think I tried to join companies that have very little politics, and for the most part have been pretty successful. But I think politics at the end of the day is really understanding how resources are shared, how people interact, and how decisions get made collectively. And so there's definitely a human psyche element of what you learn in college that I apply every day in my day-to-day job.
When your teams are international, right? When you manage teams, where are your people based?
Super international. So my last job at N26, I was based in New York and still am. I had direct reports in New York City, Barcelona, and Berlin. And that's majority of the company's global footprint, and actually all of it. And, the nationalities of my team were even more diverse than that, right? Because Berlin and Barcelona and New York are very international cities. So I was managing a lot of different nationalities on my team. And I think you have to be really conscious of like where everyone's coming from, what their cultural backgrounds are, and how they want to work. What's really cool about a lot of these tech companies and companies with a strong culture is I think they tend to be explicit about what their values are, so that when people go and apply to them, they say, yep, transparency is a value I care about, collaboration, teamwork, customers, those things I really care about. So I'm going to go opt in by selecting, by saying I want to interview. And in some ways you self-select a little bit what those commonalities are. There's been, I think, an equalizer in that sense. But it's been really helpful to have had like an international education in that sense, because I'm not starting from ground zero on the cultural competency front.
And you've traveled all over, so you kind of have to travel places and just dive into different countries and cultures pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. I'm more comfortable in places like India where I've spent a lot of time, but then the first time I was working on partnerships in Spain, I was not an expert in Spanish business. I was not an expert in the culture. And so I leaned on a lot of my colleagues who either were Spanish themselves or had done a lot of business there. And I just asked a lot of questions and try to have really open eyes and open ears when you're out at dinner with your colleagues, or when you're, in a meeting, like what's the culture, even in like the lobby leading to the meeting, like,
sure.
Super aware, because those small interactions really matter. But I see it as a challenge. I think it's fascinating. But I'm also I'm not afraid to say that I don't know. Like I'm always the first one to admit, hey, I'm a rookie at this deal, or I have no idea how to work in X country, whatever it is. And I think if you admit that up front, then people are willing to roll up their sleeves and help you on that journey. And I'm grateful for the people who've taught me so much.
That's interesting when you talk about admitting. Sometimes, again, going back to the idea of being a woman business leader, sometimes it feels like that stereotype. If you admit you don't know something and people want to be like, yep, it's because she's a woman, has that ever happened? Do you really do feel that people are usually kind and receptive?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's been some surprises, or people showed up with notions about like what a woman should or should not be, or how much that they know. But it's really funny when they're surprised. Like I was in a meeting in India where I was the only woman, I was the only American. I was definitely younger, probably 20 years of the average age in the room. And the people on the other side of the table started speaking in Hindi, and I could tell they were talking about me, and they were not thinking that my intellect was very high. And
How
after the meeting,
funny.
I was like, I said something in Hindi, and they're like, oh my God, did she hear everything that we said? And I think hopefully for them, they learned, like, don't judge a book by its
Right. Don't,
cover.
yeah, don't underestimate people.
Like, I don't know. And so I think same thing happens when I'm in taxi cabs and the driver is like shouting with all these curse words and stuff. And it's just really, I think the world is very global now. Just because you look a certain way doesn't mean that you don't know something or have done your homework, basically.
It's always fun to catch people on the language one. Speaking of doing the homework, I still thought it was funny when you were heading off to your first interview at APCO, which kind of like, launched your career. And you're like, the night before I was reading Public Relations for Dummies in Barnes and Noble. So I'm like, I gotta ace the interview.
I was like, I studied political science, but they also do PR. And I think the interview involved writing a press release. And I was like, oh my God, I don't think I've ever seen a press release. I was probably 21. And so I went to Barnes and Noble the night before flying to Washington, D.C. for this interview. And I was like, how do you write a press release? Subsequently, I went on to write hundreds of press releases. But yeah, again, if you don't know, just do your homework.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I love about you is how deeply authentic you are. And this, to me, this story is such an amazing story of it, which is, so Lindsay and I, your grandma is my aunt. And this car, this convertible Mercedes, was the car that my Aunt Barbara, your grandma, drove like when you were little. And certainly the whole time I was growing up. So on authenticity, so you tracked down this car, like what, 40, 50 years later, and said there were actually documents with her signature in the trunk. What made you even think, how did this even come about?
Yeah, so this is a story that oftentimes brings tears to my eyes, but I will not cry right now. I will not cry, but it is really a crazy story. So like you said, my grandma, your aunt, had this car for a long time. She actually had it for 30 years. And in 2010, she sold it. And I was really upset when she sold it because she didn't tell me she was going to sell it. Because I had previously said, grandma, like, I would drop little hints when I was like 15.
Oh, you had said, you told her you wanted to buy it.
I bought it from you. Yeah. And I said, grandma, why did you do that? Like, I was living in DC at the time. I was like, I told you for years I would have bought it from you. And she goes, well, Lindsay, it was just getting too old and it needed a lot of work. I didn't think that like you'd want that burden. Plus you live in DC and you don't even need a car. I said, okay, fine. And I just kind of got over it. Well, then.
Oh no, we have just lost Lindsay. So, actually, hopefully she'll be able to pop back in with us. It may have been something with her connection. So here comes again now. All right.
So then, then 2016, she sadly passed away, and we were really close. You know how what an incredible woman she was.
So sweet and so wonderful.
So wonderful, and I'd always kept my eye on these types of cars. So it's a 1977 Mercedes-Benz 450 SL, and I said, my husband, who also collects like vintage cars, we were like, you know what, why don't we just start doing some research and see if we can find a similar car, same make and model. And then I would like to buy one because it will help me like in some ways just remember my grandma. Right. And so I had done a bunch of research. I found same car, same color scheme on eBay for sale in Florida. And I've been thinking about it for a few weeks. And when this one came up, it had good number of mileage for like a 40-year-old car, right? And so you have to care about those things. And I said, I'm going to make a bid on it. It was a Sunday night. But before I bid on that car on eBay, I said, why don't I do one more Google search to see if any other cars have come up since the last 24 hours. So I search terms, 1977 Mercedes-Benz 450 SL, silver, navy, because it has a navy interior. And sure enough, this website from a Minneapolis car dealer, like a vintage car dealer, comes up, and I could tell in my internet browser that it was a link that I had not yet clicked on, right? It wasn't that clicked color. That, by the way, that's great product design there in action. And I said, oh my God, it's something new. And I clicked on it. I was going through the photos. It was beautiful. Of course, like all of them, they look just like my grandma's car. And I read the description. It was very strange. It said, age-old Missouri classic, only been owned by 2 owners. The first owner kept it in a garage in immaculate condition with detailed paperwork for every servicing for 30 years. And I said, wait a second, my grandma was a bookkeeper. She was super organized. This sounds familiar. And then I'm clicking through all the photos, and there's 42 images, and I get to the 41st image, and there's a picture of the actual car title with my grandma and grandpa's name on it and their address.
Oh my God.
And then you just start crying at that point. You're like, this is not just a car. It looks like it. It is the car. And then the final picture was a picture of a desk with all of this paperwork of the service history. So I zoomed in, I double clicked in, and I could see my dad signing off for an oil change like in 1981.
Wow.
And like, this is crazy. So I called the guy, obviously, first thing the next morning because he was closed that evening, and I bought the car. And so
do you still have it?
I still have it. So I shipped it when I bought it a couple years ago after we found it, brought it to St. Louis so my grandpa could see it. Obviously, it was a really bittersweet moment.
That's so sweet.
We drove it in their garage where I had sat for 30 years. And then we took it to San Francisco where I had it for a number of years. And then we shipped it to New York. So it sits with us in New York. Try to ride it on the weekends, and we take really good care of it. And it's just the strangest thing ever. So,
That's so sweet and so cool. So we're coming up on the one thing we touched on a little bit, but just one last thing before we say goodbye to each other. And a reminder to anyone who's watching live, feel free to send questions or comments or say hi in the comments. So you've talked about how you manage global teams, how you just kind of flow in and out as you do business in other countries. You and I both share the fact that we're both in intercultural, interfaith, completely opposite type relationships. My husband, Gino, is from Brazil, and I'm Jewish. He's not. So we've got all that stuff going on. How I almost can't imagine you having anything but an international intercultural relationship. But how does that sort of manifest your identity and who you are?
Yeah,
it's wonderful, Joffrey.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I think so. My husband's amazing. We met when he was living in London. So he's French, but he moved to the UK when he was about 24, and he had lived there in total for 7 years. And I was posted in London for Intuit, and we met there. And I think the way that it's manifested my life is like you said, I think professionally, my life was always really international. And then now on the personal side too. So my in-laws, they're amazing. They live in France and actually across the French border on the Belgian side. His grandma lives in France. We have 2 amazing nieces and nephews who are our godchildren. They're based just outside of Paris. So I have a sister-in-law in Paris, and that's just really cool. Like it obviously can make like holidays a little complex because you have to decide how to split time between France and St. Louis, where my family is. But it's just like, it's a very rich life. Like, I think that, you understand, like, and anyone who has even friends of a different culture, but especially if it's your partner, it's your spouse, like little things like communications about clearing the dishwasher or taking out the trash. Sometimes like the nuances of language really can create confusion. He speaks immaculate English, by the way. I always say better than my own. But I think the way that I speak English is very direct and very literal, whereas like some of the English spoken in places like the UK or in France would be a little bit more implied. And so like read things through body language, or it was implied since we were talking about it a minute ago. Yeah, of course, that's what I meant. I didn't have to say it. We talked about it a minute ago. So why didn't you know that? Like there's little things about communications that I think you have to like really work through when you're partnered with someone who's not of the same background. But yeah, I love seeing the world from his perspective because he had a completely different upbringing than I did. And but I think our values are the same, which are really important. I think that is a business lesson as well. You go into a business meeting with someone from different backgrounds, like, yeah, they speak a different language, they have a different culture, they're in a different political environment. But at the end of the day, we're still humans, and we care about things like our family, being trustworthy. We care about being honest, all of those things. So I think like I've discovered that in my marriage as well.
Mm. I always find that so fun, clearly in marriage, but even when you're just talking about some of the lighter things where all of a sudden you connect with someone and realize how comparable you are, like
Yeah,
in terms of your ideas or the way you, or even like sense of humor. That one's a tricky one across
totally.
languages, but that's always fun to discover when you see it in a completely different package. You're like, oh, I didn't expect that.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so, Lindsay, this show, Intercultural Talk, so it's every Wednesdays at 1, and it's all things intercultural and intergenerational, especially as relates to connecting and communicating across cultures. And I always like to say, like intercultural talk tools, you've talked on some of them. I know in my intercultural talk toolkit, self-awareness is key, curiosity about the other, the ability to take perspective. And I do say what scares you dares you. The idea of you got to push yourself out of your culture, your comfort zone. But Lindsay, is there one thing? What would you add for people to their intercultural talk toolkit?
I really love this, by the way.
Thank you.
The curiosity, so true. Self-awareness, 100%. Like,
Yeah.
admit when you don't know something, know what your blind spots are, and let curiosity help you fill those gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe like what scares you, dare you. Like another way that I think about that is adventure. Like life can get super boring by having an international perspective, whether it is your job, whether it's your personal life, or even if you don't, let's say you work in your own country, you don't travel for work, you don't travel for personal reasons, but even in the materials that you're consuming, the books that you read, like the series you watch on Netflix, like having a sense of adventure will really take you to really magical places. So I think that adventure is really important to an international.
That sounds good. And actually, I realized because my palms are sweaty just thinking of admitting that I'm wrong, like in a public business setting. So that means I have to try that.
I think the best way to think about it is like, if you admit that you're wrong, oh, cool, there's something else that I can master.
Right, there you go.
Oh, I see it as a challenge. I don't know this thing. I'm really scared of it. But like when I do know it, it's gonna feel awesome.
Funny. So you learned your public relations. That's the public relations spin. Thank you so much for the opportunity to learn something new because I have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly.
That is great. So one other thing, Natasha, who I think you've met. Natasha says, nice story about grandma's car. I know, it's so sweet. So we are going to, again, thank you for everyone who tuned in live. If you have questions afterwards, please leave them. You can tell I love you so much that actually I need to end the broadcast, which I
can talk to you all day.
I know, I could just keep going. All right, we're gonna leave. I'm gonna say goodbye to Lindsay for a second, and I just want everyone to know that next Wednesday, my guest is Linda Rosenthal. She is someone talking about daring, who jump-started change in her life by climbing like over 100 mountains and doing a handstand at the top of them. So we're gonna catch up with Linda next Wednesday, just another way to really expand your world and your horizon. So thank you so much for being here, and we will see you all next Wednesday at